Interlude 3. Of starting with saving the world. The cave heaved with fleshy masses, packed in tight. Oh, it's alive. She could practically hear her sanity being shaved away. It was remarkably pleasant. For better or for worse, the king's younger sister had had such an experience before, although she had never quite been plunged into insanity. "What the heck is that?" she squealed, plastering herself against the wall of the high cliff. "Yeah, har har, it's a big one this time." "Not as big as Hecatoncture, though," Sword Saint said, laughing merrily. Even in her blue leather armor, she looked proud and imposing. Her smile as the stinking wind tossed her hair around was like that of a beast baring its fangs. She drew the copper sword. It turned out to be a copper scimitar, on her back, the blade gleaming dangerously. Compared to the writhing mass of flesh, though, it looked no larger or more threatening than a needle. "Are you sure about this? Thing looks like it's alive, so I just have to keep slicing until it dies." "No big deal." Well, the king's younger sister thought it seemed like a big deal, but she kept any further objections to herself. "It's Jupiter's ghost," Sage, likewise pressing herself against the cliff wall, murmured softly. Beneath her pink hood, the king's younger sister could see that her doll-like face was drawn and pale. Not because of the lump of flesh, bulging with veins and nerves, that threatened to crush them against the wall. She'd noticed it ever since they'd set foot on this treacherous ground. "If we have to jump, do you think we'll make it?" "I would rather not have to find out." Using foiling control while also maintaining for other self-spells would be immensely taxing, Sage said. Then she added, "That was a joke, but the king's younger sister, it's fair to say, wasn't laughing. In some sense, this is pretty much my first adventure, right?" She thought. Her journey into the Dungeon of the Dead had been by kidnapping, then the Death Trap Dungeon as part of the dungeon exploration contest, and finally this. "Among the magic words of true power is a spell called Other Self," Sage said quietly, ignoring the young woman's state of mind. The king's younger sister was familiar with this spell. At that very moment, all of the other selves up on the surface were thanks to Sage's use of this magic. It was like those goblins, they, too, had been called forth by some complicated magic. There was once one who thought that if they had their double incant other self, they would produce ever more powerful versions of themselves. And did they really try it? Where Sage spoke softly, Hero's voice, she was dressed in green, seemed to bounce off the walls. Although her footing was no steadier than that of the rest of them, she looked as safe and comfortable as a child walking along a neighborhood fence. It was the height of foolishness. Sage looked down with utter derision at the mass of flesh below them. If her words were true, the remains of that wizard. The double had had the same thought as its master and used Other Self again. Then its double had done the same thing. From there, they'd continued replicating endlessly. The doubles had ultimately crushed the original, and with no consciousness of their own, they'd continued using Other Self. Chanting the spell would be to their advantage. It would make them stronger. So chant it they did. On and on. Forever. And this is what got us. The foolish midge suffered a heavenly erratum. The price he paid was tremendous, to him. But to the four-cornered world itself, it was trivial, the soul of a single spell user. The danger that remained, however, certainly couldn't be taken lightly. There's no question, that thing will one day swallow the four-cornered world whole. Soon the goblins would be caught up in the spell, the lump of flesh using them for food even as it continued to expand. The search for profit, the pursuit of knowledge, these were the endeavors of sentient peoples. They were the driving force that had brought the monkeys and the beasts spoken of by the lizardmen to this point. Before they had been beasts, they had been fish living in the ocean, and even before that, they had been primordial ooze. Imagine if that ooze had gotten its proverbial hands on unlimited power equal to that of a dragon or some such creature. Sage continued to stare silently down at the hideous lump that was now all that remained of the wizard. Left unchecked, the thing would bury the four-cornered world, not stopping until it had consumed every world and realm. Maybe it was the product of its persistence that after long months and years, it had finally arrived at its own sealed resting place. Neither sage, nor hero, nor the king's younger sister could fathom the will or desire of the soulless hunk of meat. Then there was Sword Saint, who had no interest in grasping such things. So we just have to kill it before it can do that, right? Yeah, I guess so, Hero replied, her lips pursed. Oh Holy Earth Mother. The king's younger sister began chanting from the depths of her heart, as every sight and every situation around her seemed beyond imagining. These three fine people with her were always fighting their way through such adventures. Now that she was with them, she couldn't just stand around screaming in panic. That wouldn't look very cool, for one thing. Her friends were up on the surface. She was, admittedly, once again having an adventure on the sly. But her own older brother had told her that at times like this, the only thing to do was grin and go for it. Magic's tough, ho, the king's younger sister said, clutching her sounding staff and grinning desperately. Absolutely, Sage agreed, smiling a little herself. Because spells are magic, in other words, miracles. Thus, truly great sages hardly ever used magic. Thus, too, it was by the direction of the very gods that the king's younger sister was here at this moment. I've heard Jupiter's ghost brings disaster. Even as she spoke, the princess was quickly going through a wide range of holy scripture in her mind, bringing her soul closer to the heavens. Doing so made one a link between heaven and earth, so one had to be careful not to get too excited all at once. Half watching her, Sword Saint said, "You're saying this thing down here is the reason the western frontier has been." "The chicken and the egg," Sage replied, bringing her staff to bear and turning her consciousness to her arts. "No one knows which came first." "Well, I sure hope it was this thing," Sword Saint replied, gamely raising her weapon. Her logic seemed a little bit off. "I wanna say, I really meant to just hang out and enjoy the contest," Hero remarked. "When things have gotten this far, the hero has to buck up and do her job. Like how I've tried to do since I got caught up in this." Hero shrugged at the king's younger sister's words. "When you put it that way, guess I've got no choice, can't let us get beat now. Just like always." Hero grinned and leaped into the fray, her black hair streaming behind her. The party brimmed with fighting spirit. Compared to them, the king's younger sister seemed to have scant power indeed. "There's not much I can do," she thought. All the more reason to do it with every ounce of her strength and her heart. Letting the heroes do all the work while she sat in safety and comfort, she'd always hated that and still did. "O Earth Mother, abounding in mercy, please, by your revered hand, cleanse this land." She felt her soul enveloped by a gentle hand, as if she were being embraced by a loving mother. It was all right. Everything would be okay. There was no question in her mind. The king's younger sister glared at the lump of flesh before her. It wasn't just about strength or effectiveness, those weren't everything. They absolutely were not. That was why she was here, and the other women, that was why Hero was here. "Gar, man. I wish we could do one adventure that doesn't involve the fate of the world," Hero said. "If that's what you want, Sword Saint began, and Sage finished for her. "Then we must begin by saving the world." "Guess so." "I just knew it," the girl, Hero, cried, and then she thrust her hand high into the air. So long as her absolute weapon, bound to her soul, was in the same dimension, it would appear in her hand instantaneously. It was a green enchanted blade that seemed to contain the light of the sun. Her absolute weapon. Hero grasped it firmly, then leaped into space. Strike of the Sun. Chapter 6. I still wanna be an adventure. "Hey, you were in there, too, little lady. How was it?" "Total loss." "Oh yeah. Yeah. But, well, I did get to have an adventure, and I had fun, so maybe it's okay." Under a clear blue sky, the girl with the iron spear across her shoulders laughed out loud. The expression on her face was as bright and refreshing as the wind that made her green outfit flutter, not a cloud in sight. "I gotcha," Spearman said when he saw it. Looks like this event of theirs went pretty well, he thought. Winter would soon be upon them, but the frontier town was bathed in the festive afterglow of the contest. People looked excited as they walked along, and conversations could be heard here and there about the contest. Young men and women chatted about whether they had participated and whether it had gone well for them or not. There was even talk of treating promising youngsters from nearby towns as guests, giving them complimentary food and lodging. It seemed to Spearman that they had much to look forward to in the new crop of adventurers who would show up the coming spring. He didn't regret not being involved in the contest, but it stung a little, a sign that it had been a good event. Thought I might feel all depressed, failing my mission while everyone else was doing theirs. But it helped his mood that the young woman in front of him showed not the slightest sign of regret herself. She would become a good adventurer, he was sure. At the very least, she had one of the most necessary talents for it. Of course, an adventurer who failed at their adventure felt bad and maybe got depressed. When life knocked them down, a lot of people gave up. But there was nothing inevitable about that. It was each individual's choice. The strength of spirit to come bouncing back after a failure wasn't an easy thing to come by. He seemed to keep running into the rookie girl, with whom his acquaintance had begun from such a small thing. Seeing her so full of heart couldn't help but bring a smile to Spearman's face. "How about you? How'd you do?" The girl's innocent question made him wince. "We hit the ruins where there was supposed to be an immortal body and soul or something." He scratched his head, offering an unaffected but disappointed grin. It wasn't untrue. He was just trying to put the best possible spin on it. But all we found down there was an empty husk. Another dead end, huh? Pretty much. He nodded, then reached out and mussed the girl's black hair. She squealed, adorable, but she wasn't unhappy about it. To be able to innocently touch a girl's hair like that, you had to have known her for quite a while. "Heck," Spearman said, "that's adventuring for you. Can't let it get you down, right?" "Sure can't." The girl found time to shoot a look in Spearman's direction as she busied herself with straightening her hair, pouting a little. The blue-clad swordswoman standing over there, and the wizard in the pink robe with her, must be the girl's party members. They made quite a sight. But Spearman wasn't sure. He had the distinct sense that their equipment didn't reflect their true abilities. Meaning, of course, that the gear wasn't as good as they were. Well, nothing he had to worry about. It was just a passing thought, maybe because a young woman who looked a lot like a priestess he knew was standing with them, chatting and laughing. Priestess came running up to the girl, joining in the laughter and the conversation, the talk blooming like a beautiful flower. It would have been easy to take the two for sisters, but Spearman wasn't about to make that mistake. Just because they were wearing the same religious vestments didn't mean you couldn't tell the difference between the two young women. It was palpable. Whatever a woman wore or whatever she did, it didn't change the fact that she was beautiful. Spearman thought that was a good thing. Beside him, his partner, Witch, smiled pointedly about something. Well, she was always doing that. The way a young girl came walking through the door of the adventurers. Guild, clearly nervous, that was perfectly ordinary, too. All of it seemed like another typical day in the town on the western frontier. "Hey, you." By this time, he was well accustomed to running errands in town. The first time, his parents had lavished praise on him, and the other kids had been duly impressed, but by now no one really reacted anymore. What's more, today he was going with his father, though he'd been told his dad had something important to discuss, so the boy should wait outside, and then he'd been left there. It had been a severe disappointment, since in spite of it all, the boy still saw himself as doing rather amazing work. All of this meant that at first, even though he was gazing absently down the road to town, he didn't even notice. When the girl came down the dirt path, the boy just blinked and watched her go by before finally calling out, She turned, puzzled. It was really her, the daughter of the alleged mercenary who lived on the edge of town. Her long black hair and her vacant expression looked the same as always. Her backpack was still too big for her, and the heavy-looking sword she carried still made her lean to one side. The boy decided, then, that it must have been the cheap leather armor she was wearing that had kept him from recognizing her. "You," he began, staring openly at the girl, who was so much slimmer than he was. "You really became an adventurer." "Uh-huh." The girl nodded, then produced her rank tag from the neck of her shirt. The glimpse of the pale skin around her collarbone as she did so set the boy's heart racing. Though he didn't know why, he ignored it and looked at the tag. The chain around the girl's delicate throat carried a small piece of porcelain, and there was a shard of some black rock on a string that quavered as she breathed. "You sure they are not pulling your leg?" "I dunno." "And what's with that rock anyway?" "It's my prize from the contest," she said happily, quite ignoring his irritated tone as she let her fingers play across the stone. She touched it as tenderly as a cherished treasure, then tucked both it and the tag back into her shirt. "I had it turned into a charm." "It looks cheap." The boy added a snort, HMPH, but the girl just said, "You think," not sounding the least bit perturbed. For some reason, that absolutely aggravated the boy, who puffed out his chest and said, "You probably just swung your sword around a bit, right? Against some, like, goblins or something." "Uh-huh. I mean, I guess. Hell, even I could deal with some goblins." That was it, he'd do a bit of bragging for her. The boy spoke with all the pride he could muster. He'd chased a goblin away from the village the other day. He'd waved a stick and flung stones. True, there'd been only one goblin, small and emaciated, and the boy had been running behind a pack of adults. But still, that didn't change the fact that he'd gotten rid of the monster. He was quite proud of himself. "How, really?" The girl showed no special interest in his story, though she just answered diffidently, "Better believe it." Desperate to get a rise out of her, the boy grinned broadly and announced, "This dungeon exploration contest, I guess it was only a game for a bunch of amateurs, huh?" "Maybe." "Hey, did you buy a helmet like I told you?" The girl was quiet for a second before she held back her bangs to show him. Wrapped around her head was a protective leather band. She softly explained that something like this wouldn't get pulled off. What a moron, the boy thought. How stupid did you have to be to get your helmet pulled off? He snorted. If he were an adventurer, he would buy a helmet, and he wouldn't be dumb enough to lose it. Supremely confident of his wisdom, the boy looked down on the obviously helpless girl and laughed. But there was a certain satisfaction, too. She'd listened to him and bought a helmet. Well, there you had it. She hadn't been able to get a prize from the dungeon exploration contest all by herself, she'd needed help. "I'll give you all kinds of advice, then." "Gosh, I don't really think so," the girl said firmly. The boy gulped and goggled. She'd never actually said no to him before. She spoke in the same small, quiet voice she always did, but it cut him to the quick. For the first time, the boy looked in the face of this girl he'd known since childhood. Her eyes as she gazed back at him were terribly clear and unflinching, like a deep wellspring. She looked at him the way you might look at a stone on the side of the road, seeing that it was there but nothing more. "Are you done?" she asked, tilting her head as if puzzled. Some sweet, pleasant smell drifted from her hair as she did so. "Okay, I'm gonna go, then." Leaving the boy still dumbstruck, the girl turned, faced forward, and walked off. She had much to do and even more to think about, and she wasn't sure where to start. First, the sewers. First, the sewers, she kept muttering to herself, even as she reached the gate at the edge of town. That was what the nice receptionist lady had recommended. She'd said they could still be dangerous, though, which made the girl a little scared. Maybe she would try the training center, too, at some point, but first she wanted to earn a little money. She'd asked around at the Adventurers Guild, and everyone had agreed that the sewers were the place to start. Getting up the courage to talk to people had been a real challenge, but they were a lot less scary than that contest facilitator. Besides, when she finally found the nerve to strike up a conversation, everyone turned out to be nice. One young man's group that seemed especially knowledgeable about the sewers had told her, "A club is your best bet." But she still didn't have any money, and she'd never used a club. She'd have to give it a try with her sword. She'd talked to the old man at the armor shop before setting out, so she knew how much a club cost. Thankfully, he'd been willing to buy the gems she'd gotten from the contest. That had enabled her to get armor, her headband, and some potions. When she'd asked for oil for her lantern, he'd thrown in some perfume oil for free. That made her very happy. Like that adventurer had said, it was important to stay calm. And she was so excitable. She hoped there wouldn't be any snakes. She was very scared of snakes. She was pretty sure there weren't any snakes in the sewers. It had been so hard fighting the goblins by herself. She was sure fighting rats would be really hard. So many things I have to keep in mind. But I'll do my best. The girl clenched her fists. Her charm glittered at her neck. The boy she'd just been talking to was already all but gone from her thoughts. The girl had a name that spread out like a tempest, whirling from the alpha, the very first letter. Roguelike, she kept walking, sure and steady, the black onyx at her neck. Ahead of her, the four-cornered world spread out, wild and vast. Goblin Slayer sat on the bench, vacantly watching Guild Girl speak to the quest giver. From time to time, adventurers who recognized him would call out to the man in the cheap-looking metal helmet, to which he would inevitably reply, "I see." The rookie adventurers, those who had participated in the dungeon exploration contest, hardly even looked at him as he sat there. Maybe it was the grubby equipment, or maybe they just didn't have the time and energy to pay him any mind, he didn't know. He certainly didn't think he'd had any time to go looking around back when he had been a novice. Of course, none of them thought the man in the grimy armor might be a silver-ranked adventurer. Why would they? That black-haired girl, she was the only exception. The one who had gotten lost during the event, she would give him a polite bow as they passed each other. "I suppose she'll become an adventurer." He wasn't thinking in terms of whether she'd registered with the guild. She was registered, just as he was. The girl would surely become an adventurer, though. He didn't know if it would go well for her, and it was certainly not his place to judge. But the girl had decided to become an adventurer, and was doing everything she needed to that end. So she certainly would become one. What about me? Yes, what about him? He let the question drift through his mind. He'd been so busy before the event, but now that it was over, well, here he was. In the grand scheme of things, what had he really done? Just slay some goblins. When it came to creating the labyrinth, setting out traps, and running the contest, he had contributed only the slightest bit. Everything in this world came down to one thing: do or do not. His master had taught him that. And if that was the case, then His thoughts were interrupted by Guild Girl, who gleefully waved a hand. "Our Goblin Slayer, sir. You can come over here now." Another guild employee, with a holy symbol hanging from her neck, stood beside Guild Girl. For some reason, she had a little grin on her face that made her look like a cat. "I think she was the one we entrusted to handle things on the surface." Goblin Slayer grunted softly and nodded slightly. Inspector looked surprised for a second, then shook her head and said, "Don't worry about it," to Guild Girl before returning to her work. "I'll have to thank her properly sometime," Goblin Slayer told himself, firmly, so he would remember it, and then he stood across from Guild Girl. She was once again wearing her usual uniform and zipping around behind the counter with all the energy of an excited puppy. She was so busy. Despite how challenging the dungeon exploration contest must have been for her, she showed no sign of fatigue. "Thank you so much for all your help, she began. "It was no problem," Goblin Slayer said clearly, seeing Guild Girl go through such pains to apologize. After all, he'd been dealing with goblins. No different from what he always did. No different at all. It wasn't that much trouble. Well, I thought it was exciting, helping out with things. Guild Girl still looked somewhat troubled. She played with her braid, she was smiling but seemed glum. Although I guess I didn't help very much. That perfume oil candy was terrible. She didn't seem to understand what he meant and merely looked at him blankly. Goblin Slayer didn't worry about it, just went on talking. If he stopped, he was sure he would simply fall silent. His childhood friend often pointed out that he went quiet when he was troubled. The smell came up out of my belly after I swallowed it. It was quite unpleasant, and it threw me off a little. Oh, really? But other than that, everything was helpful, he continued immediately. Thank you. Guild Girl didn't respond. Her expression stiffened for a second before she said, "Wait there a moment, would you?" as if she had just remembered something, then got out of her chair. She disappeared into the back before emerging at a brisk trot and resuming her place. Pardon me very much. So, after that, her words came fluently now, and she had her usual bright smile on her face. After that, what happened? I'm afraid most of the contents were lost. Goodness, she said, blinking. After a second, her smile softened, and she looked down shyly. That's all right. It doesn't matter. Ignoring the look on her face, Goblin Slayer spoke slowly and seriously, picking his words carefully. I would like to replace them for you, but I don't know much about such items. He had to tread carefully here. As far as picking them out. Let's do it together, by all means. Guild Girl said, almost jumping out of her seat. Adventurers, quest givers, and employees nearby looked in her direction. She blushed furiously, sat back down, and cleared her throat gently. A process inspector watched with a barely restrained grin. I'd like to ask you to look for the replacements with me. If you'd be so kind. That was my intention, if it's all right with you. Certainly. I see. So my lessons have borne fruit. Goblin Slayer nodded. There seemed to be no problem. He had improved. In the past, this had been an area of painful failure for him. He was very glad he had avoided simply giving Guild Girl money. He let out a breath. There, that was a good start. Time to turn to the next order of business, then. However, first I must start with goblins. Of course, Guild Girl said with a smile. Yes, I understand completely. Looking in almost impossibly good spirits, she went into the back room for a moment, nearly dancing as she returned with a sheaf of papers in her hands. Her steps were light, her movements quick and agile. Goblin Slayer thanked her and took the papers. There was a quest from a remote pioneer village, the usual fare. An emaciated goblin had appeared, and they had chased it off, but they were worried and wanted someone to investigate or hunt the creature down. The festival and its attendant pleasures notwithstanding, winter was still coming, and it was only natural people would worry about their provisions being stolen. He couldn't be sure he'd managed to kill all the goblins underground, either. Some may have escaped, and he couldn't let them live. Then again, even if this monster wasn't a survivor of his battle, goblins still had to be killed. And he was the one who killed them, it was his role. Festivals were well and good, but when they were over, one returned to ordinary daily life. That was the way of the world. Nothing to be upset about. To him, festival days and ordinary days both meant just one thing: killing. Goblins. Goblins hated days when people were enjoying themselves most of all. First, I'll have to restock the items in my bag. When his old friend had seen his torn item bag, she'd exclaimed, "Just leave it to me," full of confidence, and had set about mending it. He was sure he could trust her to do the job well. And he would be careful not to make the mistake of letting it get torn again. If there was one thing that concerned him, It was whether he'd be able to buy another of those southern-style throwing knives right away. He also wondered if he should talk to his friends. His thoughts caught on that word for a second. If he should invite them to go goblin hunting again. "I know what that is," a voice said unexpectedly from somewhere above him. "A goblin hunting quest, right?" The voice was beautiful as a ringing bell. It was the high elf, all but dangling from the second-floor railing. On her face, quite upside down, was a smile, and her long ears were twitching. "Geez, Oakbolg, that's all it ever is with you." "I see." He suspected she was right. He couldn't deny it. High Elf Archer laughed out loud, seemingly amused by the slow nod of the helmeted head. "Gosh. You really are hopeless, to borrow a phrase," she whispered, so softly it almost seemed only her lips formed the words. "If I didn't invite you on other quests, you'd never do anything else." Then one of her fingers, so pale and beautiful it almost seemed otherworldly, was pointed directly at him. "We're going on an adventure, a real adventure. The minute that goblin hunt is over." "Yes," he replied, thoroughly uncertain whether he was saying the right thing. "Let's go on an adventure."